The trauma pager screamed at 11:47 p.m., and I was already moving before I understood why the charge nurse had gone pale. Dr. Reyes Whitfield, she grabbed my sleeve, radio still crackling in her other hand. Multi-vehicle on Route 9, one critical. They're calling him Daniel Whitfield, my husband's name, coming out of a stranger's mouth in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and fear. For 1 second, I wasn't a surgeon. I was just a woman whose hands had gone cold. Then the doors banged open. The gurney came through soaked at the sheets, and somebody yelled his blood pressure was crashing. And I understood, in that instant, that I was the only surgeon standing close enough to save him. I also understood something else, something that hit me harder than the vitals scrolling across the monitor. Within the hour, his mother would be standing outside that operating room door. The same woman who once looked me in the eye at her own dinner table and called me an uneducated immigrant who'd gotten lucky marrying her son. Now her son's life was in the hands of the woman she never thought deserved to hold a scalpel. I met Daniel 11 years earlier, in a hospital cafeteria in Ohio, back when I wasn't a doctor at all, not in this country anyway. In the Philippines, I had already finished medical school. I had already treated patients, delivered babies, stitched wounds in a provincial hospital with unreliable electricity. None of that mattered the moment I stepped off a plane in the United States. My diploma qualified me for nothing here. To practice medicine in America, I had to take the same licensing exams as every other graduate, prove myself all over again, and find a residency program willing to take a chance on a 30-year-old foreign medical graduate with an accent. While I studied for those exams, I worked as a certified nursing assistant on the night shift, changing linens and helping patients to the bathroom, because it paid the bills and kept me close to the thing I had already given 10 years of my life to become. Daniel was a night shift engineer doing rounds on the building's systems. We started talking over vending machine coffee at 2 in the morning. He was the first person in years who asked about my life before America and actually waited for the answer. His mother was not so curious. I met Diane Whitfield at a Thanksgiving dinner 18 months later, in a dining room with a chandelier that cost more than I earned in 6 months. She asked what I did for work, and I told her, honestly, that I was studying for my medical boards while working as a CNA. She set down her fork very deliberately. "So you're not actually a doctor," she said. It wasn't a question. I told her I had been a doctor, in my country, and I was working to become one here. She smiled the way people smile when they've already decided something and are only pretending to listen. Later that night, when she thought I'd gone upstairs, I heard her tell Daniel in the kitchen, "I don't understand why you'd marry an uneducated immigrant who cleans bedpans for a living. You could do so much better, sweetheart." I stood on the stairs and didn't move for a long time. I didn't walk back in and defend myself. I went upstairs and cried quietly enough that no one would hear, not because I believed her, but because some exhausted part of me wondered if she was partly right, if I'd made a foolish decision leaving a country where I was already a doctor, to start from zero cleaning up after people who would never know my name. Daniel found me later. He didn't apologize for his mother. I think he knew even then that would be its own insult, speaking for her. He just sat beside me and said, "You were a doctor for 10 years before you ever set foot in this country. Don't let one dinner convince you otherwise." It didn't convince me to quit, but it planted something hard and quiet in me that outlasted every exhausted night shift that followed. The exams did not go well the first time. I failed step 2 by 4 points, on a test I'd studied for during breaks at the nursing station, in a language that wasn't the one I dreamed in. I called my mother back home, apologizing for the money the family had scraped together, telling her maybe this had all been a mistake. She said something I still think about. "You didn't cross an ocean to give up in a parking lot." I was sitting in my car outside the testing center when she said it. I retook the exam 8 months later and passed. I applied to 60 programs and got 4 interviews. I matched at 31 into a program where most of my co-residents were 7 years younger and had never worked a job that wasn't medicine. Some were kind. A few repeated my sentences back to attendings during rounds, like they were translating me. I learned to let it slide, mostly because I didn't have energy left to fight every small battle, while also learning to operate. Diane never came to my white coat ceremony. She came to my wedding, standing in the back for photos, telling relatives I was very hardworking, For someone in her situation, Daniel stopped inviting her to things that mattered to me after a while, which created its own quiet tension in our marriage, a low hum that never fully disappeared, even as I finished residency, then a trauma fellowship, then took a position at Colton Regional, the Level 2 trauma center serving our county and 3 others. We'd moved back near his family 2 years ago after his father got sick. Diane and I settled into something that wasn't warmth, but wasn't open hostility either. Polite distance, holiday dinners where she asked shallow questions and I gave shallow answers, both of us performing family for Daniel's sake. That was where things stood the night the pager went off with his name on it. They wheeled him into Bay 3, and I made myself look at him the way I look at every trauma patient first. Airway, obvious bleeding, vitals, before I let myself see him as my husband. Blood pressure low, abdomen rigid and distended, a deep laceration along his hairline. His left leg bent at an angle that told me it was fractured before anyone said so. Systolics dropping, 82/50, the resident called out. Fast shows free fluid, Morrison's pouch and splenic window. Internal bleeding, significant. I heard myself asking about mechanism of injury, loss of consciousness, in the same clipped voice I use for every trauma case, while some other part of me, behind my sternum, was screaming his name, Dr. Reyes Whitfield. Doctor. Farrow, the ER attending, put a hand on my arm. You know I have to ask. Do you want to step back? It was the right question. Hospital policy discouraged operating on immediate family for exactly this reason. I looked at the monitor. His pressure had dropped again while we were talking. Who's on call for backup? Torres, 40 minutes out, roads are bad, with a belly full of blood and a pressure that kept sliding. 40 minutes wasn't a number we had. I called Dr. Okafor, the chief of surgery, from the hallway, my voice flatter than I felt. Unstable patient, likely splenic rupture with possible liver involvement, no other surgeon available in a survivable window. And yes, the patient was my husband. I asked for verbal authorization to proceed, with Farrow scrubbing in as a second set of hands and a check on my judgment. There was a long pause. Mira, he said, using my first name for maybe the second time in 2 years. Can you do this? I don't have a choice that keeps him alive, I said. But yes, I can do this. That was when I saw her. Diane was standing at the far end of the hallway, still in the coat she must have thrown on when Daniel's brother called her, her hands pressed against her mouth. She walked toward me fast, the way people walk when they're trying not to run. Is it true? You're operating on him? There isn't another surgeon who can get here in time. His spleen is bleeding, possibly his liver. I need to open him up now. You can't, she stopped herself. You're his wife. Shouldn't someone else? There is no one else, Diane. I said it as gently as adrenaline allowed. I've done this surgery more times than I can count. I'm not going to let him die because it's uncomfortable for both of us that I'm the one holding the scalpel. She didn't answer. She just looked at me, really looked. Maybe for the first time in 11 years, and stepped back to let me pass. His spleen was ruptured, a deep laceration across the lower pole, bleeding into the peritoneal cavity, a 2-centimeter tear on the liver surface, oozing but manageable. I made the call within minutes, splenectomy, and direct pressure with hemostatic agents on the liver. Farrow worked beside me, calling numbers, handing instruments before I asked, the way you do with someone you trust. I remember the moment the spleen came fully free and the bleeding stopped, and his pressure, which had been unnervingly low for the better part of an hour, began climbing back toward something survivable. I allowed myself one full breath before going back to check for other injuries. We closed just after 2 in the morning. Vitals stable. He'd needed 4 units of blood, but the bleeding was controlled. The leg fracture would need an orthopedic consult later, but it wasn't life-threatening. As I peeled off my gloves, my hands, steady for 90 minutes, finally started shaking. Diane was still in the hallway. According to the nurse, she hadn't moved from the plastic chair the entire time. Her coat was still on. Her hands were folded so tightly, her knuckles had gone pale. She stood when she saw me. He's stable, I said, before she could ask. We removed his spleen, controlled the liver laceration without needing to remove any of it. He lost a lot of blood, but he's stable now. He'll need the ICU overnight, and surgery on his leg. But Diane, he's going to be okay. She didn't say anything at first. She looked at me the way you look at someone when a fact you'd built your whole understanding of a person around has just been proven false, undeniably in front of you. You saved him, she said. I did my job. No. She shook her head, and for the first time in 11 years, her composure actually cracked. You could have said no. Nobody would have blamed you. You chose to do it yourself, on the worst night, on your own husband and I. She pressed her knuckles to her mouth. I said terrible things to you, years ago. I don't know if you remember. I remember, I said. I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, and I wasn't going to make it easy for her by lying. I was wrong, she said. I was cruel, and I think some part of me knew it even then. I could have used that moment. I could have listed every slight, every Thanksgiving where she'd made me feel like an intruder in my own life. Some tired part of me wanted to, but standing there at 2 in the morning, still smelling like the OR, with her son alive because of work I'd trained a decade to be able to do, none of it felt worth saying. It would have cost me something, and given her nothing but a matching wound. I didn't need that. I realized I hadn't needed it in a long time. I'd just been carrying it out of habit. Thank you for saying that, I said. Right now let's just focus on Daniel. She nodded, and something in her shoulders loosened, like she'd braced for me to make her pay for it, and was almost undone that I didn't. Daniel recovered well over the following weeks. Physical therapy for the leg, a slow return to his energy, a scar along his abdomen he sometimes touched without noticing. Diane visited every day, and something between us shifted, not into warmth overnight, but into something honest. 3 months later, at a small dinner Diane herself insisted on hosting, she stood up before dessert, tapping a spoon against her glass in a way that made everyone go quiet, expecting the usual toast to Daniel's recovery. Instead, she looked at me. I've known Mira for 11 years, she said, and for most of them, I underestimated her because of where she came from and what I assumed that meant. I want to say, in front of this family, that I was wrong. My son is alive because of her hands, her training, and a decade of work I never bothered to ask her about. Her voice caught. I'm asking about it now. I'd like to hear about it, if she'll still tell me. I hadn't expected to cry that night, not after everything. But I did, quietly, the same way I had on those stairs 11 years earlier. Except this time it wasn't grief closing my throat. It was something closer to relief, the kind that comes not from winning an argument, but from finally being seen. I never brought up the exact words she'd used that first Thanksgiving, uneducated immigrant, not once, in any conversation after that night. I didn't need to say them out loud for both of us to know how far from true they'd always been, and how much further from true they were now. I had spent a decade proving something to myself that I had once, briefly, let her convince me I needed to prove to her. Standing in that operating room with my husband's life in my hands, I understood I'd already stopped needing her approval, long before she was ready to stop withholding it. The night she stood outside my OR door didn't change who I was, and only finally showed her.